This is a video from the topic B1 cell biology, looking at transport in cells. We're looking at movement of molecules, and we're looking at diffusion and examples of diffusion. So the definition of diffusion is movement of molecules. They could be gas or liquid molecules moving from a high concentration to low concentration. It doesn't have to be through any kind of membrane, okay? It can just be as simple as you spray some deodorant and it spreads out across the room, and we call that spreading out of particles diffusion. And it's due to a random movement of particles, so they'll be moving randomly and then eventually they'll be spread out across the whole room, and there'll be more of an even distribution of those particles across the whole room. Factors that affect diffusion. Concentration gradient. By this we mean how extreme is the difference between the high concentration and the low concentration. If we've just sprayed that deodorant and there's no other deodorant in the room, then we've got a really high concentration gradient. There's a really big difference between where we've sprayed the deodorant and where there is no deodorant, so where it's going to spread to. If someone's already sprayed some deodorant and there's some in the air, and then someone sprays some more, the concentration gradient isn't as steep, so it doesn't spread, it doesn't diffuse as quickly. Temperature affects rate of diffusion as well, because as we already know, particles, when they gain energy, they move faster. So if their particles are moving faster, they can spread out and they can diffuse faster. And the distance the particles must travel. If we take some fish and chips in a lift where it's a really small area, it doesn't take long for the particles to spread, to have diffused through that lift and have a fairly even distribution through the lift. Whereas if we're in a sports hall and we take the chips, it takes a lot longer for the particles to diffuse across the whole area, and once it has completely diffused, the concentration is much weaker than it would be in the lift. So to confirm then, faster diffusion when there is a large concentration gradient, a big difference between the concentration of the particles in each area, when we have a higher temperature, and when there is a shorter distance to travel. Okay, let's look at biological examples of diffusion. So we've got particles need to move in and out of cells. Okay, so particles move into cells for respiration. These would be the glucose particles, glucose molecules, and oxygen molecules. Inside that cell respiration, the chemical reaction occurs in the mitochondria, and then the waste products from that, the carbon dioxide and the water, diffuse out of the cells. All of those movements are by that process of diffusion. There's a higher concentration of glucose and oxygen in the blood, so therefore they move into the cell. Because the cell is using them up, that's why there's a low concentration inside the cell. So it keeps the reactants for respiration moving into the cell. And then through that process of respiration where the carbon dioxide and the water are produced, that creates a high concentration inside the cell. So therefore they diffuse out into the blood, and then the blood is taking those away for removal. Alveoli in the lungs. So these are the tiny air sacs in the lungs that give us the large surface area to the lungs. And when we breathe in, we take in lots of oxygen, and it's the oxygen that diffuses across the alveoli into the bloodstream. And that's because the blood that arrives at the lungs is deoxygenated. It's used up all of the oxygen, so it's low in oxygen. So there's a higher concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli moving across to the blood. It's then transported by the red blood cells to all of those cells that need the oxygen for respiration. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of respiration, and so it's diffused from those body cells into the blood. The blood then takes that carbon dioxide to the alveoli, and because there's a higher concentration in the blood, it then diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and then is removed when we exhale. Here we can see one alveoli, an alveolus, should I say. Alveoli is the plural, alveolus is singular. And we can see the blue cells there representing deoxygenated. Okay, and it's only oxygen that's carried by those red blood cells. but they become oxygenated because the concentration of oxygen is higher inside the alveoli, okay, and then it moves across, because of that high concentration to low concentration movement, across that one cell thick alveoli into the red blood cells to make them oxygenated. Let's look at adaptations of the alveoli. Just get all of our labels there so we can see the parts. Okay, so they're very thin, only one cell thick, so it makes the diffusion easy. It means that they've got less distance to travel. Network of fine capillaries, so lots and lots of different capillaries for the oxygen to go into and for the carbon dioxide to come out of. Moist, the particles don't just move across as gases, they have to be dissolved in a liquid, so the moisture around it allows the gases to dissolve, and then that's how they move across from one side to the other by diffusion. And they've got a massively large surface area. We think of the alveoli as looking almost like broccoli or a bunch of grapes, okay? Massive surface area to enable lots of gases to move backwards and forwards and make it a really efficient mechanism. Villi in the small intestine. Okay, so this is moving the glucose from the small intestine through the villi into the bloodstream. So we've digested all of the starch, we've broken it down, and we're now trying to absorb it through the small intestine, through all these villi that also are surrounded with microvilli. And this is quite an interesting one because the process begins as diffusion. So we have a high concentration of glucose in the small intestine, low concentration in the blood. It's been used up by respiration. So we get that movement by diffusion. Eventually, we get to an equilibrium. We get to the point where there is the same concentration of glucose in the small intestine as there is in the blood. So the last bit of movement to get all of the glucose out of the small intestine is actually done by active transport. And active transport is movement from low to high. So the first process by diffusion. Okay, that moves most of the glucose across from the small intestine into the bloodstream. And then when we reach that equilibrium, the rest of that glucose from the small intestine is moved by active transport. So why don't we move all of it by active transport? Because active transport is energy consuming. It requires lots of energy from release from glucose in the mitochondria of cells, okay, to supply the energy for the carrier proteins to move against the concentration gradient, to move from low to high. More about active transport on the active transport video. Okay, there's the blood vessels where you could see the particles will be moving into. So how they adapted. Same adaptations as the alveoli, thin, fine network of capillaries, moist so that the molecules can dissolve, okay, so that's what digestion is, it's making small soluble molecules that can dissolve and therefore get into the bloodstream. Large surface area with all those villi, and they're also enhanced with the microvilli, which increase the surface area even further. Next, we're looking at countercurrent flow in fish gills. Now, this basically means that when a fish opens its mouth, it changes the pressure, which forces water to go into its mouth, and then it's pushed through the gills when it closes its mouth again. So open mouth, water comes into the mouth. Closed mouth pushes the water across the gills, as you can see in that left-hand picture. And the blood flow is flowing in the opposite direction to the flow of the water. We call this a countercurrent system. And what that basically means is that it maintains a concentration gradient. It means that there's always a difference in the amount of oxygen in the gills and in the water, so that maximum oxygen can come out of the water. Okay. So we've got this continuous stream of water going across the fish gills, and then the oxygen is diffused out of that water into the gills through this countercurrent system, maintaining a concentration gradient at all times to ensure maximum absorption of oxygen. And then we've got our last diffusion example, which is in the leaf of a plant. And in the plant we have the photosynthesizing cells, so it's the reverse reaction of respiration, and in those photosynthesizing cells we have oxygen being produced and carbon dioxide being used up. So let's start with carbon dioxide. If it's being used up by those palisade cells where the photosynthesis is happening in the chloroplasts, then the concentration of carbon dioxide reduces inside the leaf. Therefore, the concentration of carbon dioxide outside the leaf is higher, and it causes the carbon dioxide to move into the leaf because the concentration is higher outside than inside. One of the products of photosynthesis is oxygen, and the oxygen is therefore at a higher concentration inside the leaf than outside, so it moves by diffusion from the inside of the leaf to the outside of the leaf. I think that's all I want to say about diffusion in the leaf. I hope you found that useful. Thank you.